So the image that I am referencing here is sort of one of these lakeside photos. I'm going to combine some elements in the sketch as we go. I might not even have a super developed sketch, and I might just mostly paint today. I do want to have my horizon line, the line where the water is sort of meeting the trees. And even if the lake sort of recedes back into the space, I can create that more through my drawing of these little edges where the islands are meeting. I'm drawing super lightly, so light you may not even be able to see it, because I really want my lines to be hidden by the end. I don't want the lines to be what is focused on. So if I end up with a line that's too dark, I can use my kneaded eraser and I can tap to make it lighter. When we're painting, I strongly recommend starting with a larger thing that's larger rather than smaller, things that are further away rather than closer, and then lighter rather than darker. It's always a lot easier to make something darker. It's much hard to take away paint, especially after it's dried onto the canvas. So I might in this one start with, I'm gonna do sort of a cloud texture in the sky. It's always good to mix up paints so we're not using them straight from the container. And so we end up with something that's more interesting. So for my clouds, I might mix up some purple and some blue and maybe even a little bit of another color to make it more neutral or more gray. I'm also adding quite a lot of water because I want to make sure that it's very opaque and see-through. Not opaque, very translucent and see-through. Wrong word. And if I'm doing clouds, instead of doing a wash, I'm just gonna sort of create a drawn pattern. Maybe my dots and patterns will get smaller as it gets further towards the horizon to show that the clouds are smaller as they are further away. And near the top of the picture, they'll be somewhat larger. Or maybe it'll just be kind of random. We can't really see that. I can even sort of lightly tap with just a little bit of paint on my brush to really blend out this edge down towards the bottom. Then I might add a light area of wash for my trees over here. I've got sort of, it looks like a lot of trees going all the way up this hill, so it's many different layers of trees. Just to begin, I might use wet and wet. So I will take my brush and get this area wet. And then I might create some different area colors of green and gently apply them to this wet on wet area. So I can use my palette to mix. If I take some green and I mix some yellow in it, you do want to wash your brush before going to colors. That'll create a nice spring green. And if I put it in here, I can also mix it with the other colors to give me an interesting background color for the trees. Maybe I'll pull some brown into this mix. And that's a darker green. But these two colors next to each other are more interesting than just one by itself. Maybe I'll mix some green in with some purple for a more neutral green. That ends up sort of almost being bluish even. So I'm starting to work in large areas and thinking about what's sort of furthest away first, or what's behind even detail layers. I also have some mountains back here that I would want to add. I'm still using the largest paintbrush since we're doing relatively larger areas right now. While an area is still wet, feel free to grab some more color and mix it in, and that'll give you more interesting results. This is all about experimentation and playing today, so we really want to spend that time getting to know how our paints are working so we can have a better idea of what they can do and how we can use them effectively. In the water, one of the things I notice is there's a lot of reflections of these trees. The reflections are sort of blurrier, but I'm going to use the wet and wet just like we did for creating the background for our trees also. And again, your picture may be different. Even if your subject matter isn't the same as what we're painting, look for common elements. Which of these techniques can you apply even if you're doing a totally different kind of landscape scene? I always like to work from light to dark. I like to apply a lot of light layers of paint first, and then you can always go back and make things darker. Right now in the lake, I might still want to add a lighter green, just like I had in the background up here. All right, so while this is drying, I'm gonna think about what layers I need to do next, and I can go back and I can take a look at my sketch, which you should have in your sketchbook, and I can take a look at my reference image and look at those things and compare them to my painting. What else could I add? What other techniques can you use? These are questions that I should be asking myself in my head as I'm painting and as I'm working. In my next layer, I think I'm going to work on focusing on isolating some of the different values. I think this mountain over here in my reference photo is a little darker, so I might go in with some blue or green paint, maybe even a mixture of brown and purple or other colors that I think are going to work nicely, and begin to apply some value. I'm using the small brush here so I can sort of create more of a texture with it more easily. I think I'll end up doing a lot of layers similar to that. And maybe I'll also begin to create some darker areas representing the reflection. I'm sort of using longer strokes. The papers here is drier, but it's still a little bit wrinkly, so I can tell it's not all the way dry compared to where it started. That's okay. If I want it to be more green, I can apply another layer of paint. That's the beauty of it. That's super bright. Yeah, so if I want to add some more sort of defined trees over here, one of the things that I kind of like is the light is sort of hitting some trees. So maybe I'll capture that by mixing another yellowish green. And sort of indicating some trees near the frontier. I'm sort of just drawing maybe the left half of the trees. This is one way to do it. Again, if you're doing a different kind of painting, yours might look different. If you have a different approach with the same type of painting, that's fine too. Today is all about experimenting and trying new things. I really think watercolor painting, you can really push the medium to its limits when you add lots of really fine layers of color. So after these dry, then I would go back in and maybe I'm going to add some contrasting darker shades over here. And as they get further away, they can sort of get smaller and closer together. I think I'll also add my yellow-green paint value color hue in the reflective area a little bit. Instead of trying to make the exact same shape, I'm sort of adding some more lines to sort of show the texture of the water. You could probably do this with a smaller brush too. I just really like the large round brush. Our reflection sort of goes all the way through, even taller than the actual trees itself. If you ever make a mistake, it's nice to have a tissue nearby. You can use it to lift up the paint. It may not lift all of it, but it can certainly lighten it, which I think is very handy. All right, I think next I'm gonna mix that dark green that I talked about for sort of the other, suggesting the other side of the trees. So I'm gonna get some green. I already have some blue and brown up here that I might pull it into because I know they'll both darken up my green and make it a little more neutral. So I can always, on a spare piece of paper, test my color. This is just printer paper. So that's honestly not bad. I might pull a little bit of brown in it just to make it even a little more neutral and grayish and darker green. I like to often try to use other colors to make it darker rather than just using the black, but that's a personal preference. And my trees sort of formed little borders here near the edges as they were drying. That's okay. I might even try to spread out my paint in a really, really thin layer on the palette so I can almost do dry brush as I go in here. So this isn't quite dry enough for dry brush, but I can really think about what kind of texture I'm trying to create. So maybe I'm sort of swirling the brush and leaving little openings. And I'm not necessarily trying to recreate every tree perfectly. It's more that I'm trying to give the general impression of trees just because I find that to be easier and less stressful than trying to recreate something perfectly. My personal opinion is that painting especially something so loose as watercolor painting, doesn't need to be about recreating something perfectly. We have photography for that. I think painting should be more about expressing an idea or a feeling. And that's what I like to try to do when I'm painting. I think it's fun. I think it's a good challenge. I think color can play a big role in that. I think the content can play a big role. I think a message is maybe harder to find in a watercolor landscape like this, because a landscape is something that is so universal. And we don't have any words, we don't have any symbols, we don't have any things giving it a particular meaning. But I think a landscape can still definitely evoke a feeling or a mood. As we go towards these trees that are further away, I might use less and less paint on my brush so that it's a lighter color. I can also additionally mix this paint with some water to make it more translucent. So I've got the same hue, but it's more see-through, which makes it look like it's further away. And I don't want to neglect my reflection down here. So we're really utilizing our time here. If we need to let it dry between a layer, we can, but we're working carefully and fully maximizing these nice studio-sized classes. So I think it doesn't look exactly like the photo that I'm referring to as my reference photo, but I think if someone looked at this, they could very easily surmise that it's some trees or some kind of foliage and a reflection and some kind of hills or mountains in the background here. I think I need to develop the clouds a little more. So I'm going to use some water and clean out a part of my paint palette and use a clean tissue just to lift away this paint in this area. So I think that color's sort of what I'm looking for. I'm gonna go in and add another layer to my clouds. Watercolor often does dry a little bit later than when you apply it. So if you apply it and you think it looks just a bit too dark, don't panic. Frequently on watercolor paper, a little bit of the paint will sort of absorb into the paper as we're painting. So it can sometimes end up being a little lighter than it looks when it's still wet. Even so, I'm gonna add a little bit of water here to dilute this paint as I go to this other side. In my reference image, I just realized the land here kind of wraps around behind this other land. I can't decide if I want to leave mine like this or if I want to add that. Maybe I'll try adding it really lightly at first. Not sure about that. Sometimes art is about simplification. You have to choose what to add and what to subtract. And there's not really right or wrong answer. It's very much about opinion. Right now I'm sort of lifting at the edges where the paint has gotten a little darker than I want it to. So I'm using a mostly dry brush, but it has just a little bit of water on it. I don't want it to be too wet that it makes the paper too wet, but I can use the brush to pick up the paint that's a little thicker here. Another thing I might do today is work on differentiating these trees and adding even some contrast in the background. I'm going to take a totally different color, so sort of a reddish brown, and we're going to go in and add some more random shadows up here and even over the trees, some of them, maybe not all of them, to give it some more variety. Because we also have the trees continuing up this slope. Right now we've only really added the trees closer down to the bottom. It's a super light layer of paint, but that's okay. Maybe I'll also get some darker green. I could even use multiple brushes. One to apply the paint, another to blend it out. And this one is drier, and this one has the wet paint. Oopsie. If you have tape and you want to save it for next time, just go ahead and grab it by the corner and grab your painting, and you can peel your whole painting up at once and leave it somewhere flat to dry.